capes and conundrums. The songs of a dozen species of ground-nesting birds is sweet on the brightly lit night. The date that the three girls decided on wasn't some in-city thing. It was a trip out to a park away from the volcanic trenches. A lot of the nearby fields were used for farming, and there was an enormous amount of fruit farms and ranches to feed the primary city. Each of these massive ranch and orchard conglomerations had small towns around them, but in general, it was one big city on Skaithak and several small towns, an entire planet with maybe 12 communities. Skaithak is mostly untamed and very, very beautiful in its ways. The unfamiliar stars stand out in many ways. There's a trinary system nearby, and directly to the right in the sky is a bright blue pulsar. There's no moon around the world, but its water is more in the earth than on it in the form of rivers, lakes, or oceans. Not a lot to fly around, Shadeflight says before smiling as she looks up. Still, there's something to be said about having plenty of open air to dance in rather than things to dance around. It's got to be a hell of a thing to be able to just fly whenever you want, Santiago notes as he looks over the great sweeping plateau of green. From the report he got, this area was more hilly some few centuries ago before a massive spike in the lava serpent population caused many of their numbers to rush out over the area and flatten the hills, burn the land, and then die in the cold, but only after leaving a trail of destruction akin to a supervolcano venting its entire chamber in a single direction. The massive migration of steel-like snakes had also widened and expanded the trench walls, while also collapsing it in other areas. Those crazy beasts were less animal and more natural disaster. "Is something bothering you?" Ambush Knight asks, and he shakes his head. "No, just lost in thought. One of these plateaus had a primitive species in the process of evolving before the lava serpents ran over them, didn't it?" He asks, and Darkscream gives out a whistle to draw his attention, and she points southeast. That way by about 50,000 kilometers. They were just getting into the most basic tool use, sharpened stones that had been broken in such a way to put an edge on them. Not quite knives, but not just rocks anymore. They didn't even have time to try passing knowledge along. "Really? That's just sad," Santiago says. He thought it was more something like an ape species that went extinct. Still tragic, but not quite a person yet. They could have gone either way from a QMO or a BMO. They were as comfortable on all fours as on two. Silver-green furred little critters that vaguely evolved from a... what do you humans call it? A badger? Darkscream says before sighing. Let's get back onto happier topics. The loss of the little silvers is always a downer at best. Right. So, beyond hunting and putting aside the sheer crazy the undaunted like myself have brought to Skaithak, what's the normal way to have fun? Oh, races are a pretty universal thing. Not to mention gliding and diving in the cooler thermals off the lava trenches. The ground-bound races usually make do with glider suits or parachutes for that. Ambush Knight answers. There's a trick for that if you've got a big enough coat to run Axiom through. It's not quite gliding, but it lets you steer yourself much more effectively as you fall. Santiago notes before his eye catches something. Wait, what's that glow over there? Ah, they're opening. Perfect, Shadowflight says. Come on, you have to see this. It's a side effect of the yearly ashfall. Oh? It'll be interesting to know how a blanket of white ash followed by rain makes things glow soft purple. It is the way the ash gets down through all the grass and flowers. The water presses it down, and the horizon racers tramp it down for good measure, Ambush Knight says. But some plants make special use of a certain something in the ash. Phosphorus? Santiago asks, as the girls lead him to an area that's slowly starting to glow more and more in response to the darkening night. Then they stop, and in silence the entire group watches as the grasses and shrubbery around them slowly open up for the flowers to display the soft purple glow of the flower petals. Hold still, Shadowflight says, and Santiago doesn't move and wonders what's about to come out next. Some kind of insect? A nocturnal bird? A bat of some kind? Something else? It's something else. Tiny, tiny little lizards with hind legs like kangaroos and little flappy webbed forewings. The inch-high lizards frantically beat their wings to increase their airtime as they hop from flower to flower and bush to bush to drink at the nectar. The little creatures, of course, end up covered in the phosphorant pollen and start spreading it around as they seem to be dancing in the glowing night from place to place. So still is Santiago that several of the tiny creatures use him like a tree to climb up and then jump off of to flutter down to a lower level and reach more of the purple flowers. At first it's just a few. Then more and more start bouncing off him as the entire flight of tiny bouncing lizards seem to learn as a group, and he goes from something to potentially avoid to a crucial part of tonight's feasting. Darkscream gives out a slight laugh at the sight of a couple leaper lizards scuffling on Santiago's shoulder to jump off first, and the flight scatters. The tiny creatures are gone and hidden in moments. "Oh, thank goodness, I needed to scratch," Santiago says, scratching at the tip of his nose. It's always when you are not supposed to move that your nose starts itching like a buzzsaw. "I know, it's awful." Ambush Knight agrees as she rubs at her wing webbing where some phosphorant pollen has been rubbed off due to the little lizards climbing over her as well. "So what are those little fellows called, and why haven't I seen them before? An animal that cute and small would likely make a very popular pet." Little leapers are awful pets. They're very social, so unless you have a lot of them, they fall into a deep depression they can die from. They're also migratory and like to move a lot, so keeping them contained will cause them to hurt themselves as they try to dig out of pens, try to break cages and hurt themselves that way, or they keep banging into transparent materials like glass. They're best left in the wild. That's a pity, Santiago notes before going quiet as what seems like a nearly sideways rainfall sweeps towards them. Everyone goes still and silent as another flight of little leapers sweeps in, and the fact that all four of them have some amount of pollen and footprints on them mean the tiny creatures instantly classify them as safe to climb all over with complete reckless abandon. This time what scares off the group is a sneeze as one of the leapers investigates Santiago's nose and tickles the hairs in there. "Little fella stuck its tongue up my nose," he protests mildly, and there's some laughter in response. "Hey, did you see? Some of them have a few feathers. It was a very rare mutation 100 years ago when it was first noticed. They're evolving. A few hundred more generations and we might have little leaping birds." Darkscream asks and Santiago considers. That's very interesting, especially if they evolve some axiom effects. Imagine them flying instead of merely leaping. They already have one. They're able to phase through thin surfaces. It's why they keep banging into things when in captivity. If your cage or pen won't resist phasing, then they just get out. But if it does resist phasing, they knock themselves silly trying to phase anyways. It's how they get through the root systems to their tiny dens underground. "I was wondering why I hadn't spotted any lizard holes," Santiago notes before considering and crouching down to the ground. He puts his hand to the dense turf beneath him and tries to feel things out. There is movement in incredible quantities. There's less a den right below them than an active highway. Wow, you'd never know it from the capital city, but Skathak is bursting at the seams with life. Most places are, even cities. Life calls to life and we're alive, Shadowflight says, and Santiago nods. "So are you wondering why we brought you out here, besides it being a beautiful experience?" "I think I figured it out. You're convincing me to stay, that even if I get posted elsewhere for me to stay here or at least quickly return to Skathak. Turning it from a place where I currently live to a home," Santiago says. "Yes, I had heard that many, if not almost all of the Undaunted thought their trip would be one way, that they would die in the stars and never see their home again, And while I can't predict the future, wouldn't it be wise to have a home again? A place where you're comfortable, that you know and are known by. To belong, Shadowflight says, and Santiago can't help but smile. It's a strange direction to try and seduce him, but not one he dislikes. It is a good point after all. It's nice to have a home. I thought we were still just at the dating stage, Santiago asks with a chuckle. Even if we somehow fail, there's no reason to chase you off or not try to have you good and locked in the area for the next girl to try. A loss is bad. A loss that makes everyone else lose is worse, Darkscream says, and he chuckles. Just in time for a little leaper to slam into his chest, because the sound of his laughing clearly meant something to the tiny animal, and its abrupt and startled stop meant something else. What? Santiago asks as all four of them watch the tiny animal leap into the turf and vanish. Do that again, see if it happens again, Ambush Knight says, and Santiago mentally shrugs before letting out a deep chuckle. It's a half-dozen little leapers this time, and they scurry all over his shirt, their tiny claws digging into the cotton, and then they leap away and vanish. Intrigued, Santiago lets out a long chuckle at roughly the same level and keeps doing it even as four little leapers pounce on him. Then, as he keeps going, more and more join in as the small and thoroughly confused reptiles scurry all over him and try to figure out the noise. Is there... Shadowflight begins, and all the little leapers scatter. Is a low-pitched sound a good sign to them? Does it mean something? If it did, then my voice would have brought them up rather than scatter them. Something beyond just pitch of the sound. Is the rumbling? He asks before humming. No little leapers land on him, and he considers. Then he starts letting out a series of hums. Then he shortens them to the point it sounds like the fast pace of laughter. The little leapers return, and everyone is still and observe even as Santiago lures in more. Then he stops, but the little creatures don't scatter right away. In fact, they go right to feeding as if nothing was wrong with the world at all. When they scatter next, one of them got a claw into a sensitive part of Ambush Knight's ear, and she flicked it by reflex. Santiago stands up straight and strokes his slowly growing stubble somewhat. I think I've accidentally signaling some kind of safety or all-clear message to the little leapers, which would prompt them to come right back out and feed, Darkscream says before smiling. We brought you out here to impress you, and you turned it back on us by accident. Freaking humans, impossible to impress. Santiago laughs at that,